The notice was taped to the door on a rainy Tuesday evening in late October. Not slipped under the doormat, not mailed with a return receipt, but aggressively taped at eye level, as if whoever placed it wanted to make absolutely certain they would see it the moment they came home. It was a single sheet of paper, official in its cold, impersonal formatting, and brutal in its message. It was not a warning. It was not a polite request. It was a legally binding eviction notice, and David and Sarah Miller had precisely 48 hours to pack up every trace of the life they had built and surrender their home to people who had never set foot inside it. David was the first to read it. He stood in the dim yellow glow of the hallway light, rainwater dripping from his jacket onto the worn corridor carpet, and read it twice before his legs carried him through the front door. He set his laptop bag down on the kitchen counter with the kind of deliberate slowness a person uses when they are trying very hard not to fall apart. Then he sat down on the edge of the couch and stared at the piece of paper in his hands until Sarah came in from the bedroom, took one look at his face, and crossed the room without a word. They had lived in that apartment in South Boston for 7 years. 7 years of scuffed baseboards and a kitchen faucet that dripped no matter how many times they fixed it, of Sunday mornings with coffee and the window cracked open just enough to let in the salt smell of the harbor, of arguments and reconciliations and the quiet, unremarkable rhythms that make a place feel permanently yours. David was 32 years old and worked as a freelance graphic designer, the kind with a good eye for architectural layouts and a client list that paid the bills most months. Sarah was 30, a substitute teacher who spent her days managing classrooms full of children who were not technically hers and did it with a patience and warmth that anyone who knew her recognized as her most defining quality. Together they had made that apartment into something that mattered. And now a company called Apex Holdings LLC had decided it was worth more to them empty. The mechanics of what Apex Holdings had done were not illegal, which was perhaps the most infuriating part. They had purchased the entire block through a shell corporation, moving quietly, filing paperwork through layers of subsidiary entities that obscured the true ownership until the ink was already dry. Once they controlled the building, a property manager named Gregory Finch had invoked something called the Substantial Renovation Clause, a notoriously elastic piece of legislation that allowed landlords to force tenants out without standard eviction cause, provided they could demonstrate that the required structural work made occupancy impossible. The law existed for legitimate purposes, to protect buildings that genuinely needed gutting before they became safety hazards. Apex Holdings used it as a scalpel to carve out rent-controlled tenants who stood between them and market-rate profits. David had refused to go quietly. He had knocked on every door in the building, gathered signatures, pooled what little resources the tenants collectively had, and hired a housing attorney named Thomas Kessler, a heavy-set, perpetually exhausted man in his late 50s who ran a one-man practice out of a cluttered office near the courthouse and had spent the better part of 3 decades fighting cases that did not make him rich. Kessler took the case on a reduced retainer because he genuinely despised developers like Apex, and for 3 months he fought. He filed motions, requested discovery, challenged the legitimacy of the renovation timeline, and argued before the judge with the particular ferocity of someone who has been doing the same righteous losing battle for long enough to have perfected their style of losing. Apex Holdings had an entire floor of corporate litigators working the case from the other side. They dragged out every hearing. They filed counter-motions. They buried Kessler in paperwork until the costs mounted beyond what the tenants could sustain, and the collective resolve that had briefly united a hallway full of strangers began to fracture under financial pressure. In the end, the judge ruled for the developers, citing the technical validity of the renovation clause, and issued the 48-hour notice that was now sitting on the kitchen counter between David and his wife, who was looking at it with the expression of someone watching something irreplaceable burn. "Where are we supposed to go?" Sarah asked. Her voice was flat, not because she was calm but because she had passed the threshold of panic and arrived somewhere quieter and more terrible on the other side of it. The Boston rental market in the current climate offered them essentially nothing. Rents had climbed to a point where comparable apartments required last month, and a security deposit that together amounted to nearly $10,000 just to get keys in hand. Their savings, already drained by 3 months of legal fees and the loss of David's biggest freelance client, a casualty of the time and mental energy the court battle had consumed, sat at exactly $22,450. It was too much money to qualify for emergency housing assistance. It was nowhere near enough to survive long-term in the city. They were caught in the particular financial no man's land that the system seemed almost deliberately engineered to create. Sarah was the one who found it. She had been up past midnight for 3 nights running, scouring foreclosure listings and county tax auction websites with the focused desperation of someone who has decided that motion, any motion, is preferable to stillness. The photo was grainy and the listing was spare with its details, but the numbers were clear. Coos County, New Hampshire. 4.5 acres of dense timberland in the Great North Woods. A 1,200-square-foot A-frame cabin built in 1974. $18,000. Cash only. As is condition. The previous owner, a man named Theodore Carmichael, had died without a will, leaving the property entangled in unpaid back taxes until the county seized it and listed it at auction. There were no bidding wars for derelict cabins 4 hours from the city. There were no competing offers. There was just a grainy photograph of a structure that nature was in the process of reclaiming, and a price that meant they could own it outright with money they already had. "No one can ever kick us out again," Sarah said, and those 8 words were enough. They wired the money to the county clerk the following morning. The drive north on Interstate 93 took them past the suburbs, past the outlet malls and chain restaurants and the gradual thinning of traffic, and eventually into a landscape that felt genuinely indifferent to human presence. The forest closed in on both sides of the 2-lane highway with the kind of density that makes the sky feel like a narrow suggestion rather than an open expanse. Cell service dropped somewhere north of Concord and did not return. They stopped for gas and a hot meal in a town so small it had a diner but no stoplight, and when David mentioned to the waitress, a stern-faced woman named Betty who wore her skepticism on the outside, that they had just bought the old Carmichael property, the ambient noise of the room seemed to drop by several degrees. Betty set down the coffee pot and looked at him with an expression that was not quite concern and not quite warning but occupied the complicated space between them. Old Ted, she said, was not simply a recluse. He was a paranoid survivalist who had not willingly let anyone within 100 yards of that cabin in decades. He muttered about government confiscation. He paid for everything in cash and conducted his errands with the focused efficiency of someone who wanted to minimize contact with other human beings as completely as possible. A man at the counter in a flannel shirt stared at the surface of his coffee and said nothing, which somehow communicated more than whatever he might have said. "Just watch your step out there," Betty said, and refilled their cups. The driveway to the property had washed out entirely, forcing them to park at the road and hike the last quarter-mile through undergrowth with their bags. The cabin, when it came into view through the trees, was a genuine confrontation with the reality of what they had purchased. The roof had developed a visible sag along its centerline. The porch had partially collapsed on one side. The windows were boarded with plywood that had long since begun to warp and split. The structure smelled, even from outside, of damp wood and long abandonment. Their first night was spent on an air mattress in the center of the living room because the bedroom floor was too soft in places for confidence. They lay in absolute darkness, listening to the settling sounds of the house and the forest surrounding it, which together produced a kind of layered silence more textured and alive than the city noise they were used to. Neither of them slept much. David stared at the ceiling and catalogued the water stains and thought about how they had started the year with an apartment they loved and ended it in a rotting cabin in the woods, And somewhere in the gap between those 2 points was a corporation that had suffered no consequences whatsoever. The anger, as it turned out, was useful. They spent the first 3 weeks in sustained, focused labor. They ripped out the moldy drywall. They scrubbed the original hardwood floors with industrial bleach until the grain showed through. They patched the roof with materials bought from the hardware store in town, where the man behind the counter had the good manners not to comment on how green they clearly were. Without a mortgage, their remaining $4,000 stretched further than it would have in the city, and the work itself had a therapeutic quality that David had not anticipated, the satisfaction of making visible progress on a problem that could be addressed with a crowbar and a utility knife, unlike the problems that had driven them here. It was during the 4th week that David noticed the discrepancy. He was measuring the living room for new baseboards, and the spatial logic of the structure had begun to nag at him in the way that incorrect numbers nag at someone whose professional training is built on precision. He was an architectural graphic designer by background. He thought in dimensions. He had sketched a rough floor plan to calculate material costs, and when he laid the exterior measurements against the interior room measurements, something was wrong. The exterior footprint of the cabin was 40 feet long. The combined interior length of the living room, kitchen, and bedroom, accounting for standard wall thickness, should have totaled 39 feet. Instead it totaled 31. 8 feet of interior space was simply missing, and the only thing occupying the center of the house between the living room and the bedroom was the massive floor-to-ceiling stone fireplace. He called Sarah in and walked her through it slowly, pointing at the sketch, then the tape measure readout, then the fireplace. "Maybe it's just dead space," she said. "An old storage closet that got walled off at some point." David pressed his ear against the heavy river rock of the fireplace and knocked his knuckles against it in several places. It was solid throughout, or seemed to be. But an 8-foot depth for a fireplace and chimney made no structural sense, and the memory of Betty's words about Carmichael's paranoia about government confiscation had been sitting in the back of his mind like a splinter. He went to the basement. The cellar was unfinished and low-ceilinged, with a dirt floor and a persistent smell of sulfur and damp clay that had made them avoid it since arrival. David went in with a heavy-duty flashlight and walked to the center of the space, directly beneath the living room fireplace, and found what he was looking for and not looking for simultaneously. Rising from the dirt floor to the wooden joists above was a wall of gray cinder blocks. The mortar work was crude and visibly different from the poured concrete of the original foundation, applied with the urgency of someone working alone and in a hurry. It was not structural. It was a concealment. He did not go upstairs for the sledgehammer immediately. He stood in the beam of the flashlight for a long moment, listening to the house settle above him, thinking about Betty's warning and the way the man at the counter had stared at his coffee. Then he went upstairs for the sledgehammer. Sarah was cautious, asking whether they were certain it wasn't load-bearing, and he explained, correctly, that the floor joists ran parallel to the wall and did not bear on it. He took a wide stance, pulled the hammer back, and drove it into the center of the cinder blocks. The first strike cracked the surface. The second split the block. The third punched through into a void beyond, and the air that came rushing out of the hole was cold and stale and carried a sharp metallic smell that had no business existing in the basement of a 40-year-old hunting cabin. David swung until he had cleared an opening wide enough to step through. He raised the flashlight and pointed it into the darkness, and the beam caught something dull and silver on the far wall. He kept swinging. The hidden room was exactly 8 feet square, tucked directly beneath the stone chimney like a sealed secret the house had been built to keep. But the room itself was almost incidental. What occupied the far wall of it stopped Sarah mid-breath when she stepped in beside him. Bolted into a reinforced steel frame and sealed behind a combination dial and a set of heavy locking bolts was a Mosseler Bank vault door. It was the kind of vault door that belonged in a 1930s Federal Reserve branch or a high-security depository, 6 feet tall and built with the assumption that nothing short of industrial equipment would ever challenge it. The spoked turn wheel gleamed dully under the flashlight. The steel was cold and utterly indifferent. It weighed, David estimated, somewhere north of a ton. "He didn't bring the vault down here," David said quietly, walking the perimeter of the hidden room, noting the way the structure around them had been built close and deliberate. "He built the house around it. This was here first." They spent 3 days getting through the door. David drove to the hardware store and returned with an industrial angle grinder, diamond-tipped cutting wheels, tungsten drill bits, and a pry bar. The work was deafening and claustrophobic, a continuous mechanical screech that filled the hidden room and traveled up through the floorboards of the cabin above, as if the house itself were in pain. They worked in shifts, wearing goggles and ear protection. They burned through cutting wheels. They snapped drill bits. On the evening of the 3rd day, David breached the inner tumbler housing and drove the locking pin out of alignment with a steel punch and a single heavy blow. The vault door opened with a groan that sounded geological, like the movement of something that had not moved in 30 years and resented the interruption. The interior was lined with heavy steel shelving. On the left side sat a vintage shortwave ham radio setup surrounded by sealed military-grade ammunition crates. On the right were stacked boxes whose contents they did not immediately examine. But the center of the vault held a heavy wooden desk, and on that desk sat 2 things that changed the entire nature of what they were looking at. The first was a stack of thick leather-bound ledgers, dozens of them, packed with dense handwritten entries in cramped cursive that suggested someone had been recording things with the meticulous anxiety of a man who believed that documentation was his only protection. The second was money. Neat bricks of it, wrapped in plastic and banded in paper, stacked in organized rows. David counted quickly and stopped counting somewhere north of $2 million. The paper bands told the story. Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. Routing and Transit Series 1982. Uncirculated currency, sequentially marked, never introduced to the general supply. This was not drug money laundered through cash businesses. This was stolen federal currency that had never changed hands on a street corner or in a back room, which meant it was completely and permanently useless to anyone who tried to spend it. Every bill in the vault was evidence of a federal crime that had never been solved. The ledgers were the real discovery. David and Sarah sat on the cold steel floor of the vault for 10 hours. They did not eat. They did not sleep. They cross-referenced pages, traced names through coded organizational charts, followed chains of corporate entities through the faded ink of Carmichael's handwriting, and assembled a picture of the man who had lived in this cabin and died here alone without ever telling anyone what he had buried beneath his living room floor. Theodore Carmichael had not been a survivalist in any ideological sense. He had been a ghost payroll architect and money launderer who had operated for more than a decade in the deepest shadow of the Boston underworld, working specifically for a man named Gennaro Angiulo, the real-life underboss of the Patriarca crime family, who ran the North End and the criminal finances of Greater Boston with a combination of brutality and bureaucratic precision that the FBI had spent years trying to untangle. Angiulo's operation ran hundreds of millions of dollars through a labyrinth of real estate shell companies, and Carmichael was the man who designed that labyrinth. He was the architect of the structure that kept the money invisible. In the early 1980s, when the FBI's surveillance of the Patriarca family intensified and indictments became a question of when rather than whether, Carmichael had recognized that his position as the man who knew everything made him equally valuable and expendable. He had skimmed $2 million from a federal currency transfer, stolen the original architectural blueprints of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston as a kind of dead man's insurance policy, and disappeared into the woods of northern New Hampshire before anyone understood he was gone. He had lived the last 30 years of his life in paranoid, obsessive solitude, tracking from a distance the downstream evolution of everything he had built. And this was where the story fractured open into something neither David nor Sarah had any framework to process. The newer ledger at the bottom of the stack contained entries in the same cramped handwriting but dated up to just 3 years before Carmichael's death. He had spent decades tracking the shell companies. He had followed the corporate entities he created through their various name changes and ownership transfers and generational handoffs, recording each mutation with the obsessive precision of a man who believed that someday someone would come looking, and when they did, he wanted a complete record. One entry stopped Sarah cold. Asset ID, Original Shell 1981. Current Holding Corporation. Apex Holdings LLC. Active. The address listed in the margin was their South Boston address. Their building. The corporation that had evicted them, that had sent Gregory Finch to tape that notice on their door in the rain, was the modern, restructured, cleaned-up descendant of a 1981 Patriarcha crime family shell company. Finch was not simply a ruthless property manager serving aggressive corporate interests. He was, knowingly or otherwise, the operational face of a real estate portfolio built entirely on laundered mob money, and he was in the process of liquidating it at the top of a tech boom market, converting decades-old criminal assets into clean, untraceable contemporary wealth. Carmichael's death had left a loose end nobody knew existed, because the cabin had been purchased under a completely disconnected alias and there was no thread connecting it to Apex Holdings or any of its predecessor entities. When he died of a heart attack and the county seized the property for unpaid taxes, his entire archive went with it, sitting unseen beneath the floorboards, waiting for someone to notice that the rooms did not add up. "They don't know," David said. His voice in the vault was very quiet. "Finch and whoever is backing him. They think the paper trail burned decades ago. They have no idea this exists." They drove back to civilization the next morning with the most important ledgers, the Federal Reserve blueprints, and a single brick of the marked currency packed into a waterproof bag. The rest stayed in the vault. They needed leverage, not evidence surrendered blindly to a local sheriff's department with no capacity to understand what they were handling. They needed Thomas Kessler. Kessler was at his desk eating a sandwich when they walked in and put the ledger and the brick of 1982 currency on the blotter in front of him. He checked the serial numbers on the bills with the reading glasses. He kept on a chain around his neck and looked up at David with an expression of complete composure that was almost certainly performed. "Tell me you didn't rob a bank," he said. "We found the man who did," David replied. Kessler listened to all of it without interrupting. When David finished, the lawyer leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a moment, and then a slow, careful smile moved across his face, the expression of someone who has spent a career fighting the same battle and has just been handed a weapon they did not expect. He explained the Kleptocracy Asset Recovery Rewards Program and the SEC Whistleblower Framework. Under those structures, private citizens who provide foundational evidence leading to the seizure of assets used in money laundering operations were entitled to a percentage of the recovered total. Apex Holdings controlled a real estate portfolio currently valued at roughly $400 million. If the DOJ moved on it with the evidence the Millers had handed them, the potential reward ran to tens of millions of dollars. "We don't only want the money," Sarah said. Kessler looked at her. "We want Gregory Finch to understand what happened." Kessler arranged a classified meeting with the FBI's Boston field office and the Department of Justice's Financial Crimes Division through channels that took 2 weeks to navigate. The federal agents arrived skeptical, treating the initial briefing with the professional caution they applied to disgruntled tenants with an axe to grind. Then Kessler produced the Federal Reserve blueprints with Carmichael's authentication marks, and the verified handwriting samples from the ledgers, and the specific corporate chain that connected Angiulo's 1981 operations to Apex Holdings' current portfolio, and the room changed. The skepticism became something focused and very still. A federal operation was authorized. David and Sarah demanded one condition. The arrest had to happen in a room where they were present. Kessler reached out to Gregory Finch under the guise of a post-eviction settlement negotiation, suggesting vaguely that his clients had uncovered historical documentation during the acquisition of a rural property that raised complicated questions about the chain of title on the South Boston building. Finch agreed to a mediation meeting with the careful overconfidence of a man who believes he holds all the relevant cards. On a Thursday morning in early spring, David and Sarah sat across a mahogany conference table from Gregory Finch in the glass-walled boardroom of Apex Holdings' downtown headquarters. Finch was dressed with the expensive precision of someone who considers appearance a power tool. He checked his watch twice before Kessler opened his briefcase, which was the last moment in the meeting that he felt comfortable. Kessler slid a single photocopied ledger page across the table. The name Gennaro Angiulo appeared on it, connected by a drawn line to the corporate name Apex Holdings LLC, in Theodore Carmichael's unmistakable cramped handwriting. The color left Finch's face in the space of a single second. The practiced confidence drained out of his posture. His hands, David noticed, had begun to shake. "Where did you get this?" Finch said. It was not quite a question. "Theodore Carmichael kept the receipts," David said. "Every one of them. He tracked the money from the Patriarca family straight into your corporate accounts. We have the original ledgers, Gregory. We have 40 years of paper trail." Finch looked at the two of them across the mahogany table and understood in full what he had done. He had evicted them. He had thrown them out of their home and into a corner of the state where a dead man's most carefully guarded secret had been waiting for someone to find it. He had created the precise conditions of his own destruction. He offered them $5 million and the deed to the building. He offered it with the shaking urgency of a man who has just understood that the people across the table from him have already made their choice. "We already have what we want," Sarah said, and stood up. The glass doors of the boardroom opened. 6 federal agents in FBI windbreakers walked in, and Gregory Finch sat back in his leather chair with the fight entirely gone from him as the handcuffs closed over his wrists. The Department of Justice froze Apex Holdings' entire portfolio within the week. The $400 million in real estate assets was seized pending criminal proceedings that would take years to fully resolve, but whose outcome was not in serious doubt given the quality of the documentation. The $2 million in Federal Reserve currency was recovered from the New Hampshire vault and returned to the government, closing a cold case that had sat unresolved for more than 3 decades. The South Boston building was ultimately transitioned into a city-administered affordable housing program. 9 months later, David and Sarah Miller stood on the porch of the cabin in New Hampshire, which no longer sagged or smelled of mildew. The rotten wood had been replaced with custom timber framing. The windows were floor-to-ceiling and looked out over 4.5 acres of forest that was entirely and permanently theirs. The Whistleblower Award, calculated at 18% of the recovered liquid assets, had arrived in a wire transfer that made the number on their bank statement feel briefly unreal. They had come north with $22,000, a waterproof bag full of evidence, and the particular clarity of people who have lost everything and found themselves with nothing left to be afraid of. What they brought back was something that no shell corporation, no renovation clause, and no Gregory Finch could reach. The system that had been designed to grind them down had driven them directly into the one place it could not follow them, and what they found there had dismantled it from the foundation up. The cabin had cost them $18,000. Everything Apex Holdings had built on stolen money and ruined lives had cost considerably more.